got up before dawn just to bring you
Top of the morning from beautiful downtown Baltimore.
Books written about the end of the Mayan calendar and the end of the world, and we thought it was very important to actually speak to people who have prophetic traditions and hear what they have to say, as well as balancing those prophecies, not of gloom and doom, but of new beginnings, with the top environmental scientists in this country from around the world. My oldest friend on the earth, a brilliant and very courageous expert witness and epidemiologist, Dr. Shira Kramer.
I'd like to start by pointing out that the earth that we live in today is very different from our environment even just 60, 70, 80 years ago. In 1930, there were approximately 1 million tons of chemicals that were produced in the United States. And if you look at this graph, it shows you that we went from 1 million tons of chemicals to over 400 million tons in the year 2000. So in a very, very short span of time, we have exponentially increased the burden of chemicals in our environment. Next slide. And this slide shows you that starting today, you probably can't read the dates, but this really begins with the contemporary period now. It is projected that chemical production is going to outpace gross domestic product and world population growth. So this trend is not flattening, it's not stopping, it's projected to continue. That is, that the burden of chemicals in our environment and on our health is going to increase, not decrease. And it's absolutely imperative that we understand the effect of this burden on our health and on our ecosystem. So in the United States today, there are more than 80,000 chemicals that are registered with the Environmental Protection Agency. That's actually an underestimate of the number of chemicals that are manufactured and utilized in our country. And thousands of them are in very, very high production volume, that is over 1 million pounds per year. The very important take-home message, though, is that of the over 80,000 chemicals that are registered with the EPA that are used in production in our country, a very, very small minority have ever been tested for toxicity or health effects in animals or humans. 43% have had no testing data whatsoever on basic toxicity, and 93% are missing the most basic toxicity data. And that's a very important fact that I would like you to keep in your minds as we walk through this talk. We are really living in a terribly, terribly burdened world in terms of chemicals, but we don't know anything about them. In Europe, there are over 100,000 registered chemical substances, and more than 99% of them have never been tested. More than 99% of the total volume of all substances on the market in 2000 were not subject to any kind of stringent testing and assessment for risk to humans. A very similar story to the United States. Again, we don't know even the most basic toxicity information about the vast majority of chemicals that are being produced in this in our environment. It is recognized that there's a general lack of knowledge about the properties and uses of existing substances, and that's from a white paper that was published in Europe in 2001. But what do we know? Of the very small number of chemicals that have been tested, what do we know about them? Well, we do know that systematic testing of new chemicals in the European market identified 70% of them as dangerous. New chemicals are chemicals that have been introduced into the marketplace after 1981, and they include the less than 1% of the total volume of all substances on the market. Remember, I just told you that in Europe, 99% of the chemicals, the 100,000 plus chemicals, have never been tested. So of the remaining 1%, 70% have been deemed dangerous. And these chemicals that are in our environment have been linked to a very, very broad range of adverse health outcomes, which include childhood cancers, adult cancers, respiratory illnesses and asthma rates, which have gone up exponentially, autism, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, adverse reproductive outcomes, including miscarriages, stillbirths, and infertility, and many, many other adverse effects. So when you look at the spectrum of toxicity of these chemicals, they're very broad, and they affect many different disease entities and organ systems. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a research group, which is a component of the World Health Organization, has evaluated 900 chemicals for carcinogenicity. That is, of the 100,000 that are in our environment, they have evaluated 900. Of those, they have identified almost half as carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic to humans. The Silent Spring Institute studied chemicals that have been shown to cause breast or mammary cancers in animals. And they have identified several hundred in their testing program so far. This slide shows you of the first subset that were published in an extensive report, how many of them have actually been identified to be in consumer products. And you can see that the opportunity for exposure to these mammary carcinogens are vast for human beings. These chemicals are in consumer products, they're in our environment, they're in our water. Our exposure is quite broad to these established carcinogens. Number two is that people are not aware of this. They're not aware that they're exposed to these chemicals and that they're exposed to them in everyday products. And that the opportunity for testing and the opportunity for identification for the public has simply not been available. You've heard mention of persistent organic pollutants, the POPs, substances which are not found in nature, which are manufactured, which are very, very stable. They do not break down in the environment. They do not break down in your body. They accumulate in human beings, and they represent a large group of chemicals which are in a very, very broad range of products. Among them are pesticides, but you have heard about polychlorinated biphenyls as an example. I'd like to just highlight the gap, the information gap that exists between the public and science in terms of these persistent organic pollutants. I venture to say that if I were to ask how many people in this room have ever heard of PCBs, very, very few people might have. How many people have ever heard of what a PCB is? Well, actually, I'm wrong. Every one of you knows what a PCB is. Maybe we should just skip this slide. No, I'm not going to skip this slide because it really makes a point. And that is that PCBs, although there was a ban on their manufacture 40 years ago, our opportunity for exposure is still quite great. They're still in our environment. They are in the food that we eat. They have bioaccumulated. They are released into the air. They were manufactured into many, many types of products that we all use and touch. And so that there is still a significant opportunity for exposure to PCBs. Every single person in this room has PCBs in their body. I think that the general public isn't aware of the fact that we bioaccumulate these chemicals. They are in our bodies. And as an example for PCBs, PCBs have been shown to be related to an increased risk of cancers in humans, to immune system disorders, to cardiovascular disease and diabetes, to endocrine disruption, and a wide range of reproductive effects. These chemicals will never go away in your body, along with the other persistent organic pollutants that are stored in body tissues. And the fact is that persistent organic pollutants, including PCBs, bioaccumulate, and that is to say that they become much, much more concentrated as you move up the food chain. So while they may start by being emitted into environmental media such as water, they are consumed by various, birds and fish and so on. So by the time they actually reach human beings, the types of chemicals that are bioaccumulated up the food chain are the most toxic and stable species among them, and they become much, much more concentrated. So that by the time human beings actually consume these chemicals, they are more concentrated and they are more toxic than the family of chemicals that were actually emitted. So by the time we start to bioaccumulate, we've got a very, very toxic brew, and they are then stored in our bodies forever. There really is no place on earth that's immune to pollution. And I have a couple of slides, this one and the next one, which show that the clouds of pollution really cover the entire earth. These are photographs that were taken from space. The top photograph shows you a cloud of particulate pollution over the entire country of China. So China, this is an actual photograph, and it's not an old photograph, it's a relatively recent photograph of particulate matter, that is very, very tiny particulates that can be, that are respirable, that you breathe in, that can get into your bloodstream, and to which chemical pollutants are attached that actually cover the entire country of China. And the bottom picture shows what it looks like after that cloud has been blown away. But these photographs indicate how large a geographic area these clouds can cover. They actually are worldwide. So there is no place on earth really that is immune to the effects of pollution and these types of toxic exposures. And indeed, in the example of PCBs, which bioaccumulate through the food chain, and especially among marine mammals, populations that live in areas which you might expect would be quite pristine, such as around the Arctic Circle, native populations, the Inuit who live around the Arctic Circle, and populations who live in the Faroe Islands, have been shown to have extraordinarily high levels of PCBs because they eat marine mammals and have immune system effects and all kinds of ill health effects that you would never expect to see in these populations. So is it just one chemical? Well, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of chemicals in our environment. And one of the very, very serious issues is that you can't look at toxicity one chemical at a time. We are living in a chemical soup. We are living in a mixture. And we do know from decades of study that chemicals and particulates interact so that there is a synergy between these various chemicals, and so that the effect of one chemical plus the effect of another is not just an additive 1 + 1. A very well-known example is the interaction between cigarette smoking and exposure to asbestos, where the risk of mesothelioma is multiple times higher than just the individual effects of cigarette smoking plus lung cancer, plus asbestos. And these examples are very, very common, including the interaction of not only just chemicals, but physical agents such as radiation in chemicals, or heat and chemicals, or radio frequency radiation, or microwave radiation in chemicals. So we have an issue that's even more serious than just this issue of one chemical at a time. We are looking at a potential threat due to the synergistic activity of multiple chemicals, and we seriously do not understand the magnitude of that risk. Now a little history about what we had proposed to do about it. Well, in 1971, for those of you who are old like me, President Nixon signed the National Cancer Act, and he created the National Cancer Institute, and he actually then proclaimed a war on cancer. He said, the time has come in America when the same kind of concentrated effort that split the atom and took man to the moon should be turned toward conquering this dread disease. Let us make a total national commitment to achieve this goal. Remember, that was in 1971, his proclamation of a war on cancer. So how are we doing? Well, between 1971 and 2004, we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars, all kinds of numbers around there, from $250 to $500 billion spent in the United States, taxpayer money, on this war on cancer. And when I think about the war on cancer, I think about the war on risk of cancer. That is, we would expect that we are going to concentrate a large part of this money and this effort on preventing cancer. So how are we doing? Cancer incidence rates, that is the rate of development of new cancers in the United States from 1975 to approximately the current time. And how do these graphs, what do they look like? Are they going down? No, they're going up. So from the time when President Nixon declared a war on cancer to today, and we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars, well, our cancer incidence rates are going up. And these incidence rates are paralleling the production of persistent organic pollutants in our environment, taking account of an appropriate period of latency for the development of cancer after exposure. And we see this for a number of cancers, but this is a particularly shocking example of our failure, because these rates have skyrocketed. And studies have shown that the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is associated with the biological concentration, the biological burden of PCBs in your body. Well, how about childhood cancer? How are we doing there? For the period of 1975 through 2008, childhood cancer incidence rates, that is the rate of development of new cancers, is going up, not going down. Now what's going down? Mortality. So that means that we're getting better at curing disease, but we're certainly not making the progress we need to make in terms of preventing disease. And that's really where the burden is. It's great to cure disease, it's very important to cure disease, but it's, in my opinion, in my view, more important to prevent it from happening in the first place. And we're not doing very well. This is a quote from the Chief Medical Officer of the American Cancer Society this year. He has admitted our data on cancer causation and cancer prevention tells us that we could have done a lot better. It's not truly a war if we have 200,000 avoidable casualties in 1 year and everybody yawns. Now, I've talked about cancer. It's not just cancer. I've chosen cancer to illustrate the problem, but as I said earlier, the toxic effects of these chemicals is not just in terms of carcinogenesis. This is an example of the very, very large increase in the prevalence of asthma in the United States, where asthma has just, again, skyrocketed in prevalence. So what should we do about it? Well, I've talked about prevention. I think that's really the key, and that's an area that has received very, very little or insufficient both funding and support. It's a lot sexier to talk about cure. And cure doesn't offend anybody. You know, you develop cures, everybody comes out looking like a rose, pharmaceutical companies make money, you can help save lives, and all of this is very good. Prevention is very messy. Prevention means that you have to have regulations to restrict the amount of emissions of industrial chemicals. You have to regulate large industries in terms of the types of chemicals and substances that they put in products and in food. And the forces that are at play in a regulatory type of debate or environment are very, very politically charged. So industry, it simply fights it. Industry is very much tied to lobbying and government, so you have the role of both industry and government in shaping the national research agenda on prevention and how those preventive activities are going to be actually carried out. Prevention is a very messy area and is very politically charged. What's interesting is that the American Cancer Society, according to their 2012 action list, if you go to their website, recommends that in order to prevent cancer, you focus on tobacco cessation, agree with that. They talk about healthy lifestyle for women. They talk about secondhand smoke, again tobacco, and nutrition and physical activity. I agree with all that, but there's a big gap there. They really don't mention anything about the environment or occupational chemical exposures. And this is what you see, it's very pervasive actually, that the conversation about preventing disease, cancer and other diseases really focuses on the things that people can control, such as cigarette smoking and physical exercise and to some degree their diet. But there's almost no conversation about this very messy and politically charged area of chemical burden. As I mentioned, there is a high level of awareness of the influence of industry and lobbying on information about risks to human health from environmental chemicals. The fact is that industry now funds a much larger percentage of academic research than ever before. The fact is that studies, it has been shown that scientific studies that are conducted by or supported by industry are more likely to be negative, to show no effect, than scientific studies that are conducted independently by academic or governmental groups. And even government studies in the research agenda are susceptible to the influence of industry because of this interconnection between money, campaigns, and politics and funding in industry. So a lot has been written about this real threat to the integrity of scientific research and the message because of the forces of large money, lobbying, and industry. Two of these references I've actually illustrated in this slide. One of them is called Doubt is Their Product, How Industry's Assault on Science Threatens Your Health. Highly recommend this book. And the other is called Inconclusive by Design, Waste, Fraud, and Abuse in Federal Environmental Health Research. There's an enormous literature on this now. Thousands of articles have been written about the threat to science due to the influence of money and corruption on science, and the fact that the public does not have access to accurate and complete information about health threats. So what is the take-home message? As I said, Disease prevention is very politically messy, difficult. You hear politicians screaming that we should get rid of the EPA, there should be no more regulation. Keep some of these facts in mind when you hear this. It's really to our benefit to understand what the ramifications are on our health to these literally tens of thousands of chemicals that are in our environment. These effects are not simply confined to ourselves. These effects are multi-generational. That means that when we are exposed, even in utero, when we are embryos, that the effects can not only be lifelong for ourselves, but can then be transferred to our children who were never directly exposed because of either changes in our genetic material or changes to the way our genes are expressed in multiple generations. This whole field of epigenetics, which has to do with the regulation of genes turning on, turning off, which genes are active at what time. It's a very, very exquisitely sensitive process, and exposures that we sustain at various ages in our lifetimes can have ramifications on successive generations without direct exposures to them. Human health is linked to a healthy environment. And I'd like to close with a quote from Jimmy Carter, who said that the awareness that health is dependent upon habits that we control makes us the first generation in history that to a large extent determines its own destiny. It's important for us to take action, become educated, be aware. Thank you.
I don't know about you, but I'm convinced of one thing. How effective has been the war on drugs? Let's think about that. Then we declared, what is this, the war on cancer. Look how effective that's been. I think we ought to get our government and the governments of the world to make a war on love, because then we would be assured that it would really proliferate. I'd like to introduce our keynote of the day, and to thank everyone who has shared so beautifully. Dr. Sandra Steingraber.